Welcome to rePROs Fight Back, a podcast where we explore all things reproductive health, rights, and justice. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and I'll be helping you stay informed around issues like birth control, abortion, sex education, and LGBTQ issues, and much, much more. Giving you the tools you need to take action and fight back. Okay, let's dive in. Hi, rePROs. Welcome to this week's bonus episode of rePROs Fight Back. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and my pronouns are she, her. Happy Pride, y'all. I hope that everybody gets a chance to take some time this month to think about how far we have come around LGBTQI rights, but to also take some time and think about how far we have yet to go. You know, for so many within the LGBTQI community, their rights have yet to be realized. There are so many with marginalized identities within that community, or marginalized identities in general, who are really still struggling. And, you know, we need to make sure that they are able to live lives that are safe, healthy, happy. And, you know, there are so many ways that LGBTQI rights are still under attack. We've talked about that most recently when we talked about the ways that states were attacking the transgender community, particularly trans kids, and not allowing trans kids to play sports that correlate with their gender identity. This is just one of many ways that we still see members of the LGBTQI struggling to live safe, happy, healthy lives. And we need to push back and keep going forward in this fight to make sure that we are creating a world where those rights are realized and everybody is able to have those safe, happy, healthy lives regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. You know, one of the things we really did on this podcast is we really focused on the ways that the previous administration was attacking LGBTQI rights, particularly within the health context within the U.S. But one thing we hadn't really spent a lot of time doing is digging into the ways that the Trump administration was also attacking LGBTQI rights through U.S. foreign policy. And we didn't get a chance to talk about it as much. And so I wanted to take some time and do that today. But I don't want it to just be a bummer episode, y'all. Like, nobody needs that right now. So we wanted to talk about what happened. We also wanted to talk about what the Biden administration has done so far around LGBTQI rights in foreign policy and globally. And all that could just be a normal episode, right? Like, this would just sounds like a regular episode. Why are we doing a bonus episode? Well, today we wanted to celebrate because today the House and Senate introduced a proactive bill around global LGBTQI rights called the GLOBE Act. And so we wanted to use this opportunity to have a bonus episode to celebrate this vision for a proactive agenda around global LGBTQI rights. So I am really excited to do that. And joining me today, I have the fabulous Andrea Gillespie with the American Jewish World Service to talk about what happened under Trump, what Biden is doing, and what we still need to do. And that includes passing the GLOBE Act, which was just introduced today. So with that, I will turn it to my interview with Andrea. Hi, Andrea. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jenny. I'm so excited.
So do you want to take a quick second and introduce yourself?
I would love to. So my name is Andrea Gillespie. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Sexual Health and Rights Policy Advisor at American Jewish World Service, or AJWS, because it's much faster to say that. And AJWS is an international human rights grant-making and advocacy organization. So we fund local grassroots human rights defenders in about 18 countries across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And then here in the United States, we elevate their calls for justice, accountability, and promote an inclusive U.S. foreign policy. And I guess one good thing to know for the purposes of this podcast and for Pride Month is that AJWS is one of the largest funders of LGBTQI rights organizations, and we are excited to stand in solidarity this Pride Month and celebrate all of the great work and all of the experiences of our partners around the world.
That is awesome. And one, you can tell that we are so used to having to introduce ourselves with our pronouns, as you should, because I forgot to remind you to do that. And you did it automatically because it's old hat now for us.
Exactly. And it's something that we do at AJWS. We have it on all of our Zooms, and we make sure to incorporate that in our meetings. And I think we're getting to a point where it's becoming second nature, hopefully across society too.
Yeah, it feels weird now when it doesn't happen.
And I realize when I forget to do it too, and it becomes like this big blank dot that I'm like, oh, darn.
Like, dang it, what did I do? It's so weird because this is so not on the outline, but the things we've been trying to make sure we're doing to be more inclusive, right? Like talking about pregnant people and stuff. And I remember it being so I had to think about it so hard to make sure I was doing it right for so long. And now when I hear other people, I'm like, oh, can you just say pregnant person or instead of woman? It's so weird. It slowly, and then all of a sudden it's so ingrained.
And it's really exciting for LGBTQI rights too. I mean, we're seeing so many bills that were just focused on women or girls or things of that nature really becoming more gender inclusive and recognizing that so many various things impact LGBTQI folks, and including pregnancy. And abortion services and all of the whole host of things that we care about. But yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to what we're actually talking about this week, which is still LGBTQI rights. But for the podcast, something that we have not been great about is talking about LGBTQI rights in a global sense, right? We've talked about all the things that the previous administration did domestically, and we've had some broader discussions where LGBTQI rights have come up globally, but we haven't had that deeper discussion. So I'm super excited to talk with you today about what's happened, where we're going, and what the audience can do. So I guess to start, I guess we have to look back. What happened under the Trump administration?
Jenny, what didn't happen under the Trump administration? And I think for so many of us in the community that works on sexual and reproductive health and rights, it's difficult to even take stock of all of the bad things that happened. And also when we talk about them, we're probably only scratching the surface because they're only the things we know about that were public. And who knows how long it's going to take to go through everything and all of the tiny little rules and regulations and all of the weird, wonky things that happened. But, that being said, I can definitely tell you a few things that really went terribly. And one of the things that I think is helpful to kind of frame the entire conversation is just that the people in the Trump administration, by and large, had very long track records of opposing LGBTQI rights, of opposing reproductive rights. I mean, when we're talking about the global context at the State Department, it was headed by Secretary Pompeo, and the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Bob Destro, also opposed trans rights and gay marriage. At USAID, the former Chief of Staff, Bethany Cosma, had devoted her work within her local school boards to opposing trans rights. And we also saw folks over at USAID and at the State Department who openly opposed access to all reproductive health care and evidence-based health care that LGBTQI folks really wanted and needed. And so based on these people sitting in positions of power, you really saw their anti-rights work filtering into the agencies. I'll start at the State Department, and because it's pride, I'm going to mention it first. Secretary Pompeo prohibited embassies from flying pride flags. And it may sound like a small thing, but LGBTQI folks around the world often saw this as a moment of solidarity. They saw embassies as the places they could go if they needed help and support. And losing that was a really big thing for so many partners who face criminalization, who experience human rights violations at the hands of law enforcement officials or their government, and the State Department didn't just do the small things, right? The State Department did the larger things. They sought to erase sexual and reproductive health and rights, pulling the term out of international spaces, deleting the reporting on reproductive rights sections. And for LGBTQI people who face stigma and discrimination in accessing healthcare services, including contraceptives, that's difficult to lose that reporting and not being able to track all of the nefarious things going on in countries around the world. And I know you've talked about this on the podcast before, and I hate to even say the words again because I'm trying to distill them from the world forever, but Secretary Pompeo's Commission on Unalienable Rights, that horribly disgusting commission that really sought to redefine what human rights were, to cherry pick and then set create a hierarchy of rights with religious freedom at the top and LGBTQI rights and reproductive rights at the bottom, did have really big consequences. And we're continuing to see the impacts of that around the world. And that's just at the State Department. And that doesn't even cover all the things that happened at USAID. There was a gender policy that was written and released that completely erased LGBTQI people. And all of this is also in the context of the Trump administration's drastically expanded Global Gag Rule, which really exacerbated the major barriers and obstacles to accessing healthcare services that LGBTQI people face around the world. And, clinics that provide the full range of services, including abortion counseling or referrals or services or information, they're often the best places to access healthcare for those in marginalized communities. They're at times some of the only friendly, non-discriminatory, or welcoming clinics that LGBTQI people can access. And so when the Global Gag Rule took effect, many of the clinics that had previously served LGBTQI individuals were shuttered or cut back on services that they'd originally provided. And that includes HIV treatment and prevention. I think a really great example comes from Amadefa. It's an organization based in Mozambique that offered LGBTQI hierarchy. And they had to close half of their clinics due to the loss of U.S. funding, which left those in the community without a trusted provider. And so while we often talk about needing to permanently end the Global Gag Rule to protect reproductive rights, we think it's also really important to highlight the enormous harm it's done across global health, especially for LGBTQI communities. So I think that's just a top line, what went wrong, but we could go on forever about so many of the different things and the policies that they changed, but we're continuing to see the damage caused by the Trump administration now. It's being exacerbated at the international level by governments that the U.S. promoted on their anti-LGBTQI platforms, whether that's Poland, whether that's Hungary, or whether that's Brazil. The legacy lives on.
Yeah, along with repro rights, the two really went hand in hand with how much the Trump administration, these people really went after LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights every opportunity they could create. It just seemed so much more than we had previously seen, where it was just so much and it was all at once.
It was, and it felt like we had to watch every space, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just the typical places that worked on international issues. We saw HHS take a much more active role in the global space than we'd ever seen before. And that office was headed up by someone who also opposed LGBTQI rights and access to reproductive health. And I see them as very reinforcing, right? Because if you're denying people access to healthcare, you're often denying them based on their gender. And for those who are of a different sexual orientation or gender identity or sex characteristics, they're often the people who have some of the hardest challenges to overcome in accessing reproductive healthcare services. And so it was kind of a 2-in-1 win for so many of these people who have been openly hostile and, quite frankly, enemies of those in the LGBTQI community around the world.
Okay, that's enough of the terrible. I'm so ready to turn my back on all of that and not have to think about it again, if only, but hopefully mostly. So let's talk about some good. What has the Biden administration done so far?
Well, thankfully, into what you just said, the Biden administration has really done a huge 180 on LGBTQI rights. And they've really started to put in place the policies that are working to actively repair and promote LGBTQI rights. Because I talked a little bit about the Global Gag Rule, I would be remiss to not mention that President Biden did rescind the Global Gag Rule within his first week in office. And he unequivocally stated that, sexual and reproductive health and rights and promoting that is the policy of the United States. And that gives us a lot of ground to point to as advocates and say, this includes LGBTQI people. LGBTQI people need to access the care, the services that they want and need, and making sure that the United States stays true to that commitment. So that was a really big moment. But of course, as you all well know, the impacts of the Global Gag Rule trickle on today, and it takes a lot more than a simple reversal to actually make true lasting change. I would say the second really big thing that happened in global LGBTQI rights was that in early February, when President Biden visited the State Department for the first time, he really centered LGBTQI rights in his comments. And then at the same time, the White House released the presidential memorandum on advancing LGBTQI rights globally. And the Obama administration had issued a similar directive back, in the bygone days that feel like forever ago at this point.
It feels forever ago.
But the Biden administration really sought to kind of build on that. And so it pulled out core tenets of what the United States should be doing. It focused on, promoting decriminalization as a policy of the United States, on promoting sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics as protected statuses. It talked about foreign assistance, which is really important to make sure that LGBTQI rights organizations that are drastically underfunded. I cannot tell you enough the need for funding for LGBTQI organizations, especially trans and intersex organizations. It elevated foreign assistance as a key priority of the United States and recognized the impacts that it had. So it was kind of a building block for what we'd want to see the U.S. engage on. And I think that we're still starting to see what that can look like as we move forward. Most importantly, it included a review of any of the policies or other things, I'll just say things, that happened under the Trump administration that would impact LGBTQI rights, and for them to review that, to compile that list, to figure out what damage had been caused, and then proactively to look at other opportunities that are rising that can strengthen the fight for global LGBTQI rights. And so we are hoping that that will be released in some form of a public way so that, civil society advocates can really work together with the government to build back better. I hate myself for that joke. I'm sorry, but I feel like you need to do it every single time. So, and, there's also just talking about the little things, which aren't actually little. The Biden-Harris administration has recognized holidays that we haven't seen recognized in the last 4 years. For the first time ever, there was a statement on Trans Visibility Day. There was comment on the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, which has a fun acronym called IDAHOBIT. It's actually one of my favorite acronyms.
So great.
Right. And, and for Pride Month, flags are flying again at embassies, and Twitters of, embassies in different countries are all done up in the rainbow flag. And that's something we haven't seen. And it's exciting to be back there and to know that our embassies are once again places that those in the LGBTQI community in countries across the world can go to and can report on the violations that they're facing, and that they can have an ally there. And that's due in no large part to the champions of LGBTQI rights that are now in positions of power. So we have Secretary Blinken and Administrator Power, who have both been really strong advocates for LGBTQI rights, and really grateful to see the other positions keep getting filled with folks who have similar feelings.
Yeah, it's really been, like you said, night and day between the two administrations. And it's so great to see the ways that this administration is really showing up. And I can't wait to see what they're going to be doing next.
Same. And there's so much work to be done. And they have people in places of power that want to get this work done and know how to get that work done. I'm thinking of Ambassador and now Administrator Power, who really took the fight for LGBTQI rights to the UN and did it unabashedly. And, it was exciting to hear her in her confirmation hearing talk about how this was an important moment for her. And, USAID has a lot of rebuilding to do. There's a lot of, for lack of a better word, trauma too for career staff at USAID and State Department who worked on LGBTQI programs who were worried to use the word trans, right? And I think it's a great moment when you now have a government that uses the word intersectionality and not in a bad way.
Yeah. And even like gender, right? Like they're more willing to say gender and not talk about women and girls only, but like seeing that it has this much broader impact and not using it in that weaponized way that the previous administration was doing.
Absolutely. And you see that too with the Gender Policy Council, speaking of the word gender, right?
Yeah.
And when it was announced, it specifically called out LGBTQI folks within its mandate, and they released their own statement tracking LGBTQI rights recently. And I think we're all still recovering, but I always get worried when I open up something and I'm like, is it going to happen? And thankfully it's happening. And we're seeing that become more normalized across a government.
So I assume as much great things as we have already seen, it's probably not enough. What are some of the priorities that the community has now to make sure that we are continuing to move forward and that we don't have some of this backsliding for if there's a new admin?
That is an amazing question, because this is the moment that we seize to really advance LGBTQI rights. We have the directive from the presidential memorandum, and we need to create some lasting change and prevent the backsliding that you mentioned. So, the first way to do this, and it is not going to surprise you or anyone else, is to permanently repeal the Global Gag Rule. I cannot emphasize enough how disastrous this policy was for LGBTQI people, including AJWS partners. And its impacts are continuing on, even though the policy was reversed. And the good news is that permanent repeal of the Global Gag Rule is both urgent and possible this year. And in Congress, obviously, as many of you know, and you know well, the Global HER Act, led and championed by two incredible LGBTQI advocates in their own right, Senator Jeanne Shaheen and Congresswoman Barbara Lee, it would permanently repeal this harmful policy and prevent it from coming back in the future, right? So we can look forward to more progressive legislation that would actually enable LGBTQI people to access abortion services. And I'm thinking too about, moving towards repeal of the Helms Amendment to make sure that all people are able to access the care that they want and need, including HIV treatment and prevention services. So that's the first priority that I've really want to highlight for this hierarchy, especially because LGBTQI people often don't get talked about within the context of the Global Gag Rule. And I think a lot of that is because there just hasn't been as much research done, and that's something that we need to do.
Yeah, that's so important to elevate because, we talked about how much, particularly this expanded version, was hurting so many different areas. But you're right. I think that often the LGBTQI community gets left out.
Yeah. And I think, one of the exciting things is there are organizations, LGBTQI organizations, that have been advocating against the Global Gag Rule for the last 4 years because they knew, right? They knew what these impacts looked like. And so it's been a really great moment to see solidarity across the women and girls space, the LGBTQI space, the sex worker space, all uniting in opposition to a really harmful policy. And so it's just really collecting that into one area to elevate this as a primary reason why marginalized folks were under attack under the Trump administration and previous administrations and previous iterations of the policy. So I think, too, as we're talking about funding and it is appropriation season, everyone is having so much fun with the release of the president's budget. I'm sure all of our friends on the Hill had a wonderful Memorial Day weekend.
Yes, the late Friday drop of a budget was not exactly what the holiday weekend present I wanted.
Or, maybe the present that we didn't realize we needed.
There we go.
Who knows? But it would be bad of me to not really highlight the fact that LGBTQI rights programs desperately need more funding. So at the State Department, there's the Global Equality Fund, and at USAID, there is the protection of LGBTQI persons. And both of these programs do incredible work combating stigma, violence, discrimination, providing safety and security, and really working on shifting norms in countries around the world so that LGBTQI people are, more supported and are able to access all of the services that you see in everyday life, whether that's housing or employment or justice mechanisms, right? And unfortunately, both of those programs at state and USAID are two of the smallest pots of human rights funding in general. Congress puts aside about $16 million a year. And this year, we are advocating for an increase to $60 million in total, which reflects the amount of pure demand that we see for these funds, right? They're only able to give out to satisfy about 6% of the requests that they receive, which is a very small pittance. And I hate to use the word pittance, but it really is, because these are incredible organizations doing grassroots work that are changing the ways in which their communities are able to really build capacity, right? And without that funding, it's hard for LGBTQI organizations to stay afloat. And thankfully, Congressman Cicilline has been really leading the charge on this. As the chair of the LGBTQ Equality Caucus, there is no one else who's ready to throw down for funding for LGBTQI rights programs at State Department and USAID. And so hopefully we'll be seeing some more money from Congress this year to coincide too with the presidential memorandum and build out that progressive look. And it's not just the LGBTQI rights programs that need to be funded. We need to see more funding too for some of those global health accounts that really support LGBTQI people, whether that's the International Family Planning and Reproductive Health or the PEPFAR Global Fund. Both of those accounts are so critical to funding LGBTQI organizations and also providing them with access to healthcare services. So that's kind of a second bucket. So we have first, permanent repeal of the Global Gag Rule. Second is funding. And the third, and one that I'm really excited to talk about today because it's very new and hot off the press, is the Greater Leadership Overseas for the Benefit of Equality, or GLOBE Act. GLOBE. I love the acronyms.
I know. The acronyms are so fun.
But the GLOBE Act is really a comprehensive gold standard of global LGBTQI rights bill. So it is led by Representative Titus in the House and Senators Markey, Shaheen, and Markley in the Senate. And it recognizes the intersectional nature of LGBTQI rights and all of the different foreign policy tools that impact global LGBTQI rights, whether that is human rights reporting or leadership in multilateral spaces or protections for LGBTQI folks in asylum and immigration, to really making global health more inclusive and supportive, including in the HIV treatment and prevention spaces. And one exciting thing to note this time, the bill has been around for the last Congress, but they've added actually reporting on the impacts of the Global Gag Rule on LGBTQI populations to this bill because all of our champions in Congress that work on LGBTQI rights have recognized that this is an important moment to see that. And they want to have the evidence behind them to give us another reason why we need permanent repeal. So I think it's been really great to see momentum build behind the GLOBE Act. It had 80 co-sponsors last year, and that number is just growing this year in the House. And in the Senate, it had 20 at the end of the session, and we're still seeing folks come on. And so making sure that people in Congress are writing their names down and standing for global LGBTQI rights so that we can get some of this done. We can get some of these foreign policy pieces to actually center LGBTQI rights is a huge moment that we're excited to have our champions leading.
Yeah, it's so exciting to see it being reintroduced today. And it's just really, it's so exciting to see proactive policy. Like, we've been playing defense for so long. The last 4 years are like this black hole you like try not to think about because it was so much defense all the time. And while there were proactive things being done, it just, I don't know, there's so much more excitement this time to think of possibilities because they feel more possible, I guess.
They really do. And I mean, I was so excited when this bill was first introduced and first thought of by the leads.
Yeah.
Because it showed that there were people committed to thinking about a future where LGBTQI rights were front and center, and they knew that future was possible. And I'd like to think that that future could be sometime in the next 4 years, in the next 8 years, and I'd really love to keep seeing energy and momentum build behind this bill. And hopefully, one thing that we will see on the House side is that it's going to come to fruition, especially with the first ever LGBTQI specific hearing in the House Foreign Affairs Committee this year. So a huge thank you to Chairman Meeks for supporting that, inviting global LGBTQI civil society advocates to be a part of that historical moment.
That's it's just all so exciting.
We're not used to it, I know.
I know, right? Okay. So we always like to wrap up by focusing on what can the audience do? So what actions can the audience take to make this vision happen?
Yes. Call your representatives, call your senators, ask them to co-sponsor the Global Her Act, which repeals the Global Gag Rule if they haven't, and to really champion that to pass this year and to stand strong in doing so. That's the first action you can take. There's a big week of action coming up at the end of June from a bunch of sexual and reproductive health and rights organizations. And I'm sure that you can get involved by signing petitions, by calling in any way that you would like to really get that over the finish line. The second thing, while you're on the phone with your congressional office, is asking them to co-sponsor the GLOBE Act. We've heard that it is so important for constituents to elevate their voices and identify global LGBTQI rights as a priority. And by doing so, you can help build this momentum that we are seeking to create a more inclusive U.S. foreign policy. So those are two actionable steps that you can really take that will, support so many LGBTQI human rights defenders around the world. And speaking from an AJWS perspective, support AJWS partners that are some of the most incredible groups and that are really on the front lines doing the hard, difficult, life-changing work that they are.
I always love when there are concrete actions that people can take. And don't worry, y'all, you will for sure be hearing more about the week of action around Global Gag Rule here. We have a bunch of things planned for during that week. And yeah, so make sure to call your congresspeople about Global Her and the GLOBE Act.
Yes, we are so excited.
Well, Andrea, thank you so much for being here today. As always, it is a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I was so excited to mark Pride with you here on rePROs Fight Back.
Yes. Happy Pride, everybody.
Happy Pride.
Okay, y'all. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Andrea. I had so much fun talking to her. It was great to talk about proactive things and to talk about the GLOBE Act. Y'all, it's so exciting to see it reintroduced in the House and the Senate. And like I said, to take a little moment to celebrate. So with that, I will see y'all back next week for our regularly scheduled episode. But if you want to reach out to me, always feel free. You can email me at jenny@reprosfightback.com, or you can reach out to us on social media at rePROs Fight Back on Facebook and Twitter, or rePROs FB on Instagram. Otherwise, I will see y'all next week. For more information, including show notes from this episode and previous episodes, please visit us at our website at reprosfightback.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at reprosfightback and on Instagram at reprosfb. If you like our show, please help others find it by sharing it with your friends, and please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening.